Hello, this is another instalment in our series of lectures on the Ogham, or Ogham, the Irish alphabet, or the ancient Irish alphabet, that is to say. This time we're on to the letter Tonya, which is that one, or if you want the wooden version, can you see that? Just about. There we go. So, as far as our cheesy props from previous ones go, we've done Uath, the hawthorn, and Dúr, the oak, so we're now down to here Tonya, which is commonly translated, at least in terms of the tree alphabet, as holly, the holly tree, although it doesn't actually mean that at all. The word Tonya means an ingot, a bar of iron, like a bar of iron or gold or whatever. Primarily iron, but an ingot in general. One of the Riaha Ogham, the little sentences, the phrases that come in sets of three of them, one of them translates as fire of coal or marrow of charcoal. You can translate it either way, Shmur Gwaila. I think that's how you say the Irish way. If we're thinking of a bar of iron, then obviously that conjures up images of the blacksmith, and therefore the charcoal, the coal, heating it up, this kind of white hot heat, the core of heat, if you like, the marrow of heat in the fire, in which that ingot can be plunged and heated up until it's white hot, and then beaten out to make a sword or a spearhead or an axe head or whatever it is that's going to be made from it. So it links to imagery of smithing and blacksmithing, or at least it does for me at any rate, and that notion of intensity. Now the other two of the Briaha one is Trian Row, a third of a wheel. That's the idea that an old-fashioned wooden wheel like you'd find on a wagon, you've got the rim, the hub, and then the spokes coming off the hub to join with the rim, and each bit would be made of a different type of wood. So the flexible wood on the rim and the very strong wood on the hub and so on. And holly is, or was traditionally, at least back when wagon wheels were made of wood in that way, before tyres and rubber and everything else became the norm for vehicles. That holly was one of the three woods used in making a wheel. So it becomes a third of a wheel, one part of a wheel. The final one is trianeum, third of a weapon. And we can take that, perhaps you want to think of the sword, for example, as being made in sections. The blade, the hilt, and the I was going to say handle, that's the wrong word to use, the guard that's used to protect the hand as three sections of a sword. Then the holly could be seen as the wooden handle that goes around the end of the blade that shoots off. I'm sure there's blacksmiths and swordsmiths have a technical word for that, but the holly becomes one part of that, so a third is mentioned in two different contexts, the third of the wheel and the third of the weapon. We can potentially link that into other contexts, more mythical contexts as well, in that when the gods of Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann, are going, well, in the lead up really to the second battle of Moyture, they are oppressed, they are under the heel of the Vemori, they're horrible slobbering monsters that come out of the ocean. Although some of them are good looking, but by and large they're horrible slobbering monsters that come out of the ocean and enslave the gods of Ireland and all of the peoples of Ireland. And one of the ways that the listeners to the old oral tales, or the readers of the written down versions, know that these are particularly dreadful and oppressive tyrants and wicked awful monsters is that they hike taxes. And that be a lesson to anyone in the position of imposing taxes. If you hike taxes, you join the ranks of the monsters that need to be overthrown. And the scale of the taxes they hike, is in how high up it goes, is to the level of 1/3. This is seen as desperately oppressive, that they demand 1/3 of all of the grain harvested in Ireland, and 1/3 of all of the farm animals, 1/3 of the milk, 1/3 of the children to be taken off into slavery. And this is seen as just horribly excessive. And so the Second Battle of Moyturray, at least in part, is somewhat like the poll tax riots that we had in this country a few decades ago, of people rising up against excessive taxation, and that greed of the ruling classes being seen as the sort of final straw, that they put up with all of the other indignities, like Ogham being made to fetch firewood, and the Dagda being made to build walls and all this sort of thing. So they're put up and put up and put up with one indignity after another, and finally they snap with the sheer volume of taxes being imposed. Now, it could just be sheer coincidence that we've got 1/3 of a wheel, 1/3 of a weapon, and this myth about the 1/3 of all produce or all goods going in taxation. But I personally think there is a bit of a connection in that the excessive demands of 1/3 then lead to the warfare in which the 1/3 of a weapon, everyone takes up their swords and they go out and go to war against the oppressive for more. There is it seems to me, a connection there. Now, where does the idea of demanding 1/3 in taxes come from? Is this just an example of what was seen at the day as a ludicrously high number, and no ruler in their right mind would demand as much as that, and therefore let's make these monsters go beyond what any ordinary political mundane government would impose? Or was there some sort of symbolic imagery going on here? And I think perhaps we can also look to examples from folklore and fairy tales of various different beings who take frequently 1/3 is the given percentage, where the hero or heroine of the story gains something, and there is a rather to say dark, sinister figure, a magical figure, who demands 1/3 of what they've got and takes it away and runs off with it. Perhaps this was seen as a kind of an unfair bargain to make, to demand 1/3 of anybody's income or produce or benefit, and therefore anyone engaging in the demanding of 1/3 puts themselves beyond the pale and becomes someone that has to be rebelled against, battled against, fought against. And so perhaps there is a sense there of greed. This is the defining line of where greed comes in, perhaps, in most stories. So if you're doing a divinatory reading for someone, for example, Tonya comes up, it could be taken to symbolise a debt or something that is owed to another, or will be at least demanded by somebody else. Whether it really is 1/3 or it's a different percentage, nonetheless, there's a sense perhaps that whatever others are demanding of you is onerous, it's excessive and burdensome, or burdensome to the person you're doing the reading for, and that they will feel exploited, ripped off, as if they are gaining very little for all of their hard labours, because here's this greedy bastard coming along and taking away far too much, more than they deserve, as their cut of the take in terms of whatever that take may be in the individual reading or the individual understanding. In terms of the colour Ogham, we have Taman, which means dark grey, which, well, the bark of a holly is often quite a dark grey. The wood is very, very white, especially once you obviously strip the bark, and if you're a common usage for holly wood, not holly word, but the wood of the holly tree, was making furniture, because it was seen as a particularly attractive wood once it was all dried and polished and what have you. Sort of furniture made from the wood of the holly tree would stand out and be seen as particularly yeah, visually appealing in the home. But the bark itself is quite grey, and this colour imagery of tame and dark grey. There's very little direct imagery here that we can associate with myth, except, as I think we mentioned when we were talking about Louche, whose colour imagery is Lear, which is pale grey, so pale grey and dark grey, is that the colour grey, whether light or dark, is associated with mist, with fog for fairly obvious reasons, and mysterious figures that move around in the mists. So in Scotland we have the Fir Lear, the grey man, who is something like a kind of a Scottish Yeti almost. This huge, giant, hairy figure that lives up mountains in Scotland and is sometimes seen loitering in the mists and scaring the living daylights out of mountaineers and wanderers and travellers in the mountains. So far as I can find, I've not ever come across any myths in which the Fir Lear actually kills anyone or murders people in the mountains. So he just kind of loiters off slightly in the distance and scares the crap out of people who see this giant figure coming towards them. But no accounts of him actually murdering people or maiming them or anything like that. So perhaps not a dangerous figure, but one that's seen as intimidating or sinister or a potential threat. And I suppose it might be stretching it a little bit to link that into what we were saying earlier about taxation and excessive burdens, but perhaps again that idea that something is seen, whether it's an institutional force, a governmental force, or it's a weird figure in the mists, is seen as a threat, as imposing, worrying, alarming, something looming towards you that you need to be very conscious of, and to make plans to prepare for. Maybe that's stretching it a little bit too much at a divinatory reading, but kind of thinking in that line. The Cailleach, the old woman of winter, is also often referred to as robed in grey and this very kind of somewhat scary figure of not only of winter but of the mists of late autumn. This wild, long-shinned figure who leaps about, scaring again the life out of people. A little bit, in many respects, like Baba Yaga in Russian myth. That whilst she can sometimes be helpful, and there are stories in which she takes a more positive role, she's also a quite alarming, disturbing figure, leaping about battlefields and frightening the daylights out of people on quite a regular basis. Bird-wise, we have Truth, or sometimes Tutek. In both accounts, the translation is starling. The starling, which again is a sort of dark grey to black colour in terms of its plumage, so it's sort of dark, I'm not saying dark grey to black, not dark black. In terms of mythical appearance, the starling, I can only find one story in which the starling appears, and it's actually in the Mabinogion, the Welsh stories, although it's part of the Mabinogion that is set in Ireland. So there is not, which is quite an interesting thing, I've never come across an Irish version of this story, only the Welsh version of it. So the particular part of the Mabinogion in question is the one that deals with Bran and his sister Branwen. Bran the Blessed, who is one of the great kings of the island of the mighty, King of Britain. And we have an unusual pair of siblings in that Bran, the brother, is gargantuan. He is so tall he cannot fit in any building. He is an absolute giant. But his sister, Branwen, is normal size. And quite why the brother should be a giant and the sister a normal size is never explained in the surviving accounts of the story. It may, of course, be that there was once a story that accounted for why one was gigantic and the other normal, but that particular story, if it ever existed in the first place, has been lost. Now, Bran means raven, And Branwen can be translated either as the white raven or as the blessed raven. And the wen, which can mean white or blessed, is a suitably ambiguous term, that it can go either way. Long story short, Bran is approached, because obviously the day and age in which these stories are set, the system of governance was quite patriarchal. So Bran, as the king and brother, is approached by one of the then kings of Ireland, Matholwch, which is a Welsh word. So whatever his Irish name is, we don't know, but in Wales he was called Matholwch. Comes across and is trying to make a deal with the brother for a peace treaty between the peoples of Ireland, or at least that particular tribe in Ireland, and the people of Wales, and by extension the rest of Britain too. And the sealing of this deal is that Matholwch should marry Branwen. And so she becomes a pawn, if you like, in the political games to broker peace, but a relatively willing pawn. She's not dragged kicking and screaming to the altar. She perhaps understands the politics of the situation, and she goes along with it and participates in this marriage. And at first, everything goes well, until one of her relatives, Evnisian, disrupts the wedding celebrations. Evnisian, like the wicked fairy in the Cinderella stories, sorry, the Sleeping Beauty stories, has not been invited to the wedding, and Evnisian takes offence at not being invited to the wedding, and so turns up and disrupts the wedding by doing some really, really horrible things to the horses that belong to the Irish guests. And there has to be a big payoff. Bran makes a big payoff as compensation to the Irish guests for the horrible things done to their horses by his relative. And it kind of smooths the water over, and they all sort of, the wedding goes off and it is done with. And the Irish, and Branwen as the queen of the Irish tribe, king's wife, they all go back to Ireland, and everything looks as if it's going to be okay. And for the first few weeks it is. But the courtiers, once they get back to Ireland, grumble and grumble and grumble and grumble about how the compensation wasn't enough, and how even with the compensation, still the insult of what was done to their horses by this dreadful Evnisian is so great that really Matholwch should put aside this Welsh trollop and find himself a good Irish wife and all the rest of it. And Matholwch is effectively corrupted by the incessant complaining of his courtiers, and starts to treat his wife more and more harshly, more and more brutally, and eventually agrees to have her put away from him. By the time she is put away from him, she has already become pregnant and given birth to their son Gwaean, which again is a Welsh name. Gwaean means alder, so we're going back to one of the previous Ogham's that we've looked at, the fern, which is the Irish way of saying Gwaean. Gwaean and fern mean the same thing, one in Irish, one in Welsh. So she becomes the mother of Fern, or Gwaean, the mother of the alder tree spirit. But even though she's provided the king with an heir, she is still treated very shittily, and she's made to be, she's kind of deposed, I suppose you'd call it, as queen, and made to become a servant in the kitchens, to scrub and fetch and carry and do all the dirty, filthy jobs, things that any highborn lady of ancient Wales or ancient Ireland would never have done in their lives. But she's forced into doing that, and it's recorded that the cook in charge of the kitchens is quite violent, that if Branwen doesn't fetch and carry quickly enough, she gets a slap round the ear from the cook. And so there's a degree of violence and brutality, as well as forced labour, as well as effective imprisonment, that she's not allowed to go back to her family. She's kept there and humiliated rather than sent home to Wales. And this general shitty behaviour goes on for 7 years. And at no point in that 7 years does anyone from Wales come over to visit Branwen, which I think is a little odd, but again, there may be a significance to the number 7 taking place here. 7 being the number of Dur, the previous letter to the one we're looking at. This is the 8th letter, so it's the previous one. Dur is the 2nd letter of the alphabet. So again, there might be a bit of a number symbolism going on there behind the 7 years of imprisonment. During her 7 years as a lackey in the kitchens, this is where we get to the point, she trains a starling. How she trains the starling, who knows, I don't suppose it really matters anyway. But she trains this starling, and finally at the end of the 7 years she feels it's trained enough, I suppose, and she writes out a message on a tiny little bit of paper, wraps it around the starling's leg, and just like a carrier pigeon, she sends the carrier starling to fly all the way back from Ireland over the Channel to Wales and to her brother. Now, how the starling knows where to find Bran and which directions to go in, and none of that matters. That's all just, plot sideline. But the starling finds the brother. I suppose he's so big it's hard to miss him. And the bird perches on his shoulder and goes, "Oh, hello, little bird." And he's obviously got remarkably good eyesight for a giant, because he can see in this perfectly tiny, ordinary starling has a little message wrapped around its leg, and he takes the message off. And with his amazing eyesight on this little bit of paper, and he's this 100-foot tall giant, he reads this plea for help from his sister. And like any good brother, he's outraged by the horrible things being done to his sister, goes ballistic, summons his armies and his courtiers and tells them what's going on, and they storm across to Ireland to kick Matholwch's arse into 30 Shades of Purple. And again, long story short, after much toing, froing, coming and going, and conniving and magic and mystery, there is a huge, huge war between the Welsh and the Irish, which ends with almost all of the Irish dead, of that tribe at any rate, not necessarily every Irish person in the whole of Ireland, but of that tribe. Only 7 survivors of the Irish, and equally only 7 survivors of the Welsh. So we're back to that number 7 again, cropping up in different instances in that particular myth. But that's pretty much where the presence of the starling ends, is in carrying this message from Branwen to Bran. And interesting that even though Bran and Branwen have raven as part of their name, it's not a raven that's trained up to carry the message, it's a starling that's trained up to carry the message. So what meanings can we interpret from that, from the imagery of starlings? That they are messengers, perhaps particularly messengers from those desperately in need, those who are being misused, abused, oppressed, battered, imprisoned, downtrodden, treated like dirt. It could therefore be seen if somebody had dreams of starlings, or is doing a bit of bird divination and the starling flies past, or what have you, that this is a cry for help from those who are very vulnerable, particularly those who are in some context trapped. So it's a call for liberation, to help set free someone who is stuck in a desperate situation. Which I suppose, again stretching the point somewhat here, going back to all the stuff about taxation and the second battle of Moytray to overthrow the tyrants and the overlords, it's a similar kind of thing again, people being oppressed, being put upon, being stuck in a situation they can't seem to get out of, putting up with bullying and abuse and exploitation, but finally throwing off the shackles, finally, setting, well, in this instance, in the Battle of Moytray, they don't send for their big brother to come and set them free, they set themselves free. But again, the Battle of Moytray, rather like the story in the Mabinogion, there's a hell of a lot of death in that story. There's a lot of gore and guts and carnage. And so it's a reminder, perhaps, that freedom from oppression comes at a very, very heavy cost. It's not just kind of given to you on a plate with an apology and here's some compensation. There you go. It's fought for with guts and gore and death and loss on both sides. Both those who are doing the oppressing get mangled, but also those being oppressed get mangled. Something to perhaps bear in mind there that I can't remember which song is it. It's an American song, isn't it? Freedom isn't free. I can't remember the exact line in the song, but it's along that line that freedom has to be fought for, and it's not just given to you on a plate. It comes at a very heavy cost. Number-wise, we've mentioned this. This is the 8th letter of the Ogham alphabet. I can't find any instances in the surviving stories in which the number 8 plays much of a role, which could be just because I'm not looking hard enough, and maybe there is an example that I've completely forgotten about and never came across in the first place. But the symbolism there is uncertain, let's put it like that, at the moment anyway, unless someone can point me towards something that I'm oblivious to at the moment. So moving from there to the holly tree itself, putting the ingot to one side. I already mentioned the uses of the wood in furniture making, popular for walking sticks and walking stocks, and obviously holly leaves at Yuletide, midwinter, for decorating the home and bringing, in the days before tinsel and gaudy, horrible, ugly plastic tack to put around your house at Christmas, bringing in evergreens such as holly to decorate the house was a very popular thing to do. And for Christians, certainly, a lot of Christians associated both the thorniness, the spikiness of the holly leaf and the redness of the berries as emblematic of the crown of thorns on the head of Christ and his blood settling on the crown of thorns. And so again, an image of sacrifice, an image of bloodshed and loss, to gain liberation. But for a Christian, it's liberation from sin and Satan and wickedness and so on, rather than from a specific oppressive individual, an oppressive husband or an oppressive wife or an oppressive government. It's more spiritual liberation in the Christian sense, which there's no reason you couldn't integrate that similar theme. The pagan side of things doesn't make a great deal of the idea of liberation from sin, but you could certainly say that all of us have our own dark side, our own grim impulses to nastiness and spitefulness and greed and dishonesty and brutality and one thing and another. And that to live a generally happier life, we need to, I don't know if you can ever fully liberate yourself from that side of your nature, but shall we say come to terms with it, achieve some degree of balance. The pagan traditions tend to favour more integration rather than liberation and putting sin away. It's more about coming to terms with it, but not being dominated by the darkness within you, not being a slave to your own dark impulses, being freed from that kind of dominance. You could go with that as an image, perhaps, and work with that. At a herbal level, the berries are unpleasant to consume. They are mildly poisonous, and there are some cases of children eating so many holly berries that they actually died. One account I've found suggests over 20 is a potentially lethal dose for a small child. As with any poison, size of body and general state of health is a key factor. The bigger you are, generally speaking, the heavier a dose is needed to cause serious problems, and likewise, the smaller you are, the smaller the dose that's needed. But your general state of health is also a key factor in that. So you can take that suggestion of 20 plus berries. Yes, I don't know if it was that suggestion comes from any sort of medical source or it was just a bit sort of someone's personal opinion on that front. Before most people would get to the point of killing themselves off, if you eat a handful of holly berries, you're much more likely to spew up everywhere. So not many people would manage to cram enough down their throats to kill them most people get a bit, some berries down their throat, then spew them all straight back up again. And it has been used specifically to induce vomiting in cases of people who have taken poisons that then need to make them vomit those poisons back up, to use a weaker poison to vomit up the stronger poison. Or in case of various other illnesses where you're trying to get somebody to throw up for whatever reason. So it has been used in that context. I've also found sources suggesting that holly berries and holly leaves are very healthy, very good for rabbits and for sheep. Apparently very popular to chew on, both for rabbits and sheep. Don't know if that's true. I've never owned a rabbit or a sheep, so I don't know, but put that there as a suggestion. And that ground up powdered holly berries were in the past applied to bandages and then slapped over wounds in the belief, rightly or wrongly, that the powdered up holly berries would help to stop, slow down and eventually stop the flow of blood. I don't know what the medical basis for that is. So that could simply be one of these um, potions of yesteryear that turn out to be bugger all use to anyone. So if you are bleeding, please don't go and sprinkle yourself in holly powder, because I've no idea if it actually works. But just as a thing I found in old herbal books from a few hundred years ago. That's one of the uses for it. The last thing worth mentioning briefly, of course, is the summer-winter imagery of the Oak King and the Holly King. Previous letter is the oak, this letter is the holly. The very idea of the oak and holly kings seems to be a mid-late 20th century idea, and use of those two particular trees to create the imagery. It's not an ancient traditional thing going back to year dot. It's modern day pagans, historians, mythographers looking at patterns in mythology from many different parts of the world and seeing patterns cropping up and then linking those patterns together in a way possibly people in the ancient world would not have done themselves. So the idea that the king of winter fights the king of summer, and that at least in some myths these fights take place at midsummer and midwinter, although there are other myths in other places, and sometimes it's women rather than men. So on the Isle of Man there is a clash between the queen of winter and the queen of summer, rather than kings. But a lot of modern day pagans, particularly those very interested in Wicca, have gone sort of embraced wholeheartedly the imagery of the Oak King and the Holly King, will reenact rituals with two guys dressed up, having a stick fight or whatever type of fight they're going to have, to reenact the turning of the seasons, so that the winter takes over for one half of the year and then the summer takes over for the other half of the year. And in some stories at least, there is an element in which there is a woman being fought for. And the woman is often taken, at least by modern readers, to represent sovereignty, the governance of the land. So in one part of the year, the king of winter wins the hand of the queen of the land, and in the other part of the year, the king of summer wins the hand of the queen of the land. There are other interpretations that can be put upon those stories, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that we can look to ancient Irish myth and ancient Welsh myth to find absolute irrefutable evidence of holly kings and oak kings. There are suggestions like the stories involving Cuchulainn and the giant who gets beheaded, which itself is very paralleled by the story of Gawain and the Green Knight in Welsh Arthurian myth. So there are elements that crop up which lend themselves to that sort of a reading, but sometimes the reading is a little bit stretched, and it's perhaps putting much more of a modern spin on things than the way they would have been understood hundreds, if not sometimes thousands of years ago. So you could associate Tonya with the winter, but I think maybe that's stretching it a little bit to see Durin Tonya as representing summer and winter. I think that's a very modern spin, rather than necessarily the way people in early Ireland would have been thinking about those two letters. But I mention it there because it's the sort of thing, if you're reading around in books on and tree symbolism and the rest of it, sort of thing you're highly likely to come up against. But I'll leave that one there because I've waffled on enough, and at some point in the not too distant future, we'll get onto the next letter of the alphabet.